Most people know the iconic behind-the-scenes photos from film history. These images tell stories that take us to places that the film never really would have ever taken us to. But what if I told you there was another category of these behind-the-scene photos? Images that told stories that were just as powerful, just as unforgettable, but in a much darker light. Let's talk about some of the most haunting photographs ever taken on movie sets and the stories behind them. Twilight Zone the movie was supposed to be a big-budget anthology film bringing the classic TV series to theaters. 4 segments directed by 4 different filmmakers: John Landis, Steven Spielberg, John Dante, and George Miller. The John Landis segment followed a racist man who gets transported through time and experiencing prejudice from the other side. Moments like a Jewish man in Nazi-occupied France, a black man facing the KKK, and finally, a Vietnamese man during the Vietnam War. At 2:20 in the morning on July 3rd, 1982, in the Indian Dunes in Valencia, California, actor Vic Morrow, famous for being in the show Combat, is doing a scene where he's walking across shallow water holding 2 children in his arms, 7-year-old Micah Din Lee and 6-year-old Renee Shin Yi Chen. Above them, a helicopter hovers, roughly 24 feet over their heads, while pyrotechnic explosives are being detonated all around them for the scene. This Vietnam War scene, directed by John Landis, had a very special vision. He wanted actual kids instead of body doubles, to give that more real look while carrying them through the water. Prop dummies weren't as good as they were now, so he decided to hire actual kids on the spot. The only problem is that these kids were illegally hired and breaking child labor laws, working way past midnight. But Landis simply didn't care about that. He mostly cared about getting the perfect shot. According to reports, Vic had hesitations about this scene beforehand. He allegedly said, "I must be out of my mind to be doing this. I should have asked for a stunt double. What can they do but kill me?" Right? During the fatal take, special effects explosions damaged the helicopter's tail rotor. The aircraft spun out of control and crashed. Vic and Lee were decapitated by the helicopter's main rotor blades, and Chen was crushed to death by the helicopter. By the landing of the entire vehicle, all 3 had almost died instantly. The chilling part of this is multiple cameras had captured the incident, and the footage still exists, but remains restricted among a lot of sites. The images that do exist are from moments before, with Vic in the water and children in his arms, and the helicopter overhead. Just another night of filming, except it wasn't. The thing about this tragedy is how completely preventable it was. Multiple safety violations, illegal hiring practices, and a director who pushed boundaries until people died. John Landis was charged with involuntary manslaughter along with 4 other crew members, and they were all acquitted. The parents of the 2 children sued and received settlements. Vic's daughter also sued and settled. But no amount of money will bring these 3 people back to a director who was just trying to get the perfect shot instead of keeping safety as his #1 priority. The Twilight Zone accident is one of those moments that has fundamentally changed how Hollywood handles dangerous stunts, likely involving children and aircraft, and it's one of the most infamous accidents in Hollywood history to this day. New regulations were placed, stricter oversight among children acting this late, and there were better safety protocols that were put in place. All things that should have existed way before we had to kill 3 people on camera. The Crow was a dark gothic revenge story based on J.M. Barr's underground comic book. Bruce Lee's son, Brandon Lee, played Eric Draven, a rock musician who's brutally murdered along with his fiancée the night before their wedding. 1 year later, he's resurrected by a mystical crow to seek vengeance on the gang that killed them. The film was drenched in atmosphere, rain-soaked streets, industrial decay, and a moody soundtrack. It was Brandon's first chance to step out from his great father's legacy into the spotlight of acting himself. On March 31st, 1993, Brandon Lee was 3 days away from finishing the film, and while he was filming a scene where his character Eric walks into his apartment to find his fiancée being attacked, a thug named Funboy, played by Michael Massey, fires a gun at him almost 12 feet away. The problem with this is that the gun had been improperly prepared. Earlier in production, dummy cartridges with real bullet tips but no powder were used for the close-up shots, but one of those dummy bullets became lodged into the barrel, and when they filmed this scene with blank rounds, which contained powder but no bullet, the blank's explosive launched the bullet at lethal velocity, and it struck Lee in the abdomen. After being shot, Lee fell backward instead of forward as choreographed. The crew initially thought he was still acting, but stunt coordinator Jeff Amata immediately recognized something was wrong when Lee remained unconscious and breathing heavily. He was then rushed to the hospital, and after 6 hours of emergency surgery, Brandon Lee was pronounced dead at 28 years old. Michael Massey, the actor who fired the fatal shot, never recovered from the trauma. He carried guilt until his own death in about 2016. In interviews, Massey spoke about the burden of having been the person that pulled the trigger. even though it was clearly an accident caused by negligence in the props department. He took a year off from acting after Lee's death and reportedly had nightmares about it for years. The last photos we have of Brandon Lee are these photos of him in costume, just doing his job, just another day of work. Except, it was his last. Brandon's mother, Linda Lee Caldwell, who had already lost her husband Bruce Lee under mysterious circumstances in 1973, now had to bury her only son. The family that had become synonymous with martial arts excellence was now equally known for tragedy. The movie was completed using a combination of stunt double, digital effects, and script rewrites. It was released in 1994 and became a cult classic, dedicated to Brandon Lee's memory, but watching knowing what happened cast a shadow over the film itself. This was supposed to be Brandon's breakout role. Instead, it was the final role he was going to have. After Brandon Lee's death, the film industry implemented much stricter protocols to gun safety on set, and everyone thought it was never going to happen again, until 2021. Rust was a low-budget western starring and produced by Alec Baldwin. He played Harlan Rust, an outlaw on the run with his 13-year-old grandson after the boy is being sentenced to hanging for accidental killing. It was the kind of gritty, character-driven western that rarely gets made anymore. The production was troubled from the start, with budget issues, crew complaints about working conditions, and concerns about safety protocols already. Several crew members had already even walked off set before this fatal incident. On October 21st in 2021, a small mock church on the set of New Mexico, cinematographer Halen Hutchins, who was 42 years old at the time, stands behind the camera with a headset on, observing production. Alec Baldwin stands in costume in front of the church, and they start rehearsing a scene. A crew member captured what he called the last photo with Helena on set. It shows the church interior moments before the shooting, normal, professional, just any other day of filming. The assistant director Dave Halls handed Baldwin a propped gun, declaring it a cold gun, industry terminology for an unloaded weapon. But the gun contained a live round, and during rehearsal, Baldwin discharged the weapon, and the bullet struck Hutchins in the chest. It then passed through and injured the director Joel Souza, who was standing right behind her. Electrician Serv Saventoy was standing shoulder to shoulder with Hutchins when the gun fired. He later wrote, "I was holding her in my arms while she was dying. Her blood was on my hands." Hutchins was flown by helicopter to the University of Mexico hospital, and she did die from her injuries, leaving behind a husband and a 9-year-old son. The question everyone asks was really simple. How did a live round get on a movie set? Multiple investigations revealed a catastrophic breakdown in safety protocols. The armorer, Hannah Gutierrez Reed, was inexperienced and had expressed concerns about not being ready for the job. Several crew members had walked off set that morning of the shooting, citing safety concerns. There had been previous accidental discharges with firearms on set, and red flags virtually everywhere. But production simply continued anyway. Corners were cut, and safety protocols were likely ignored, and the budget was already tight, as we know. 30 years later since Brandon Lee's death, how are we still having the same conversation about cold weapons secretly being hot on set and killing people in the process? Alec Baldwin has maintained that he didn't pull the trigger, even though through FBI analysis, this contradicted his claim. Hannah Gutierrez Reed, the armorer, was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 18 months in prison. Assistant Director Dave Hall took a plea deal, and Baldwin's own involuntary manslaughter charges were dismissed in July 2024 due to prosecutorial misconduct. But none of that brings Helena Hutchinson back, and in an industry that was male-dominated, a female cinematographer literally dying on set just doesn't happen often. None of this changes that her final last moments on Earth were spent doing her job, something that she loved, trusting in the people she worked around and following basic safety protocols. Midnight Rider was an unauthorized biopic about Greg Allman of the Allman Brothers Band, starring William Hunt. The production was troubled from the very beginning, with disputes over the rights to Allman's life and a shoestring of budget that they really had. While filming a dream sequence that was supposed to show Allman in a hospital bed that transitions into a surreal outdoor scene, the kind of artsy visual metaphor of an independent film that people love to make, the classic waking up on the alarm, the classic waking up in the woods, moments like that. To get this shot, director Randall Miller wanted to place the hospital bed on the railroad tracks for maximum atmospheric effect. The only problem is that they decided to film on an active railroad. And on February 20th, 2014, in Georgia, the crew was on said active railway set, and they didn't have permission to be there. Never before seen photos show 27-year-old camera assistant Sarah Jones slatting a shot with actor William. Other images show the crew with the equipment on the train tracks itself and the trestle moments after a train had passed. They positioned a metal frame twin bed on the tracks for the shot. Director Randall Miller had been told by railroad officials that they couldn't film on the tracks. He did it anyway. He believed they had a window of time between the trains. He was wrong. The crew members saw a train barreling toward them at high speed and blaring its horn. Chaos soon erupted. With Sarah Jones, who was carrying several bags of camera equipment, people urged to drop the gear and run. Hairstylist Joyce Gilliard was on the trestle, and she later described what had happened. When the train collided with the bed and mattress, debris flew in the air, struck Jones, and propelled her into the train's path. Julia herself lost her left arm when the train's forces ripped it from her body. Sarah Jones died at that scene. Her body was found on the gangplank below, and she was only 27 years old, at the beginning of what should have been a long career in the film industry. The engineer operating the train that killed Sarah Jones suffered from severe psychological trauma, as he was approaching 55 miles per hour with his horn blaring and watching people scramble to get off the tracks, knowing he couldn't stop or prevent anything in time. He saw Sarah Jones die right through the window, and he couldn't do anything to prevent it. The incident sparked a wide movement called Safety for Sarah, with crew members began wearing Slate for Sarah stickers, and the movement pushed for better safety standards when conditions feel unsafe, and an industry-wide recognition that no shot is worth a life. Director Randall Miller pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and criminal trespass. He served 1 year in jail for making a decision that killed a person and permanently maimed another. Executive producer Jay Serdish also pleaded guilty and served time. The production company was only fined $74,000. The movie was obviously never completed, all that destruction for absolutely nothing. Poltergeist was Tobe Hooper's suburban horror film produced and co-written by Steven Spielberg. It followed the Freeling family whose home has been invaded by spirits that communicated through the television and eventually abduct their youngest daughter, Carol Ann, into another dimension. The film was oddly PG rated, but still genuinely terrifying. Clown dolls coming to life, a guy tearing his face off in the bathroom mirror, and the infamous pool scene where the mother falls into the backyard pool and finds herself surrounded by skeletons erupting in mud. The pool scene is so iconic because actress Jo Beth Williams spent 4 to 5 days filming in mud and water, surrounded by what she believed was prop skeletons, which is a reasonable assumption. She found out later, along with the entire crew, that the production did use real skeletons. But why did they do this? Because it was cheaper than creating fake ones. The fact that it was financially more efficient to acquire actual human remains than creating convincing props is absolutely jarring to me. Special effects makeup artist Craig Reardon confirmed it. 13 skeletons who were dressed and sculpted with rubber paint to look like decomposing cadavers. And Jo Beth Williams spent days swimming with actual human remains without her knowledge or consent. When Williams found out, she was understandably disturbed. She discussed about how unsettling it was, realizing she was being intimate and getting physical contact with real dead bodies. She had been pushing them away from her face in scenes, they were tangled around her legs, and all the human bones came from real people who had real lives and probably also didn't consent to be used in horror movie props. But Poltergeist was one of those last major productions to use them before practices were largely discontinued, partially due to the effect of ethical concerns of using real human remains, as fake skeletons could be made more convincing. The revelation that added to the Poltergeist reputation as a cursed film is when 4 cast members died within 6 years of the film's release. Dominique Dunne, who played the oldest daughter Dana, was murdered by her ex-boyfriend in 1982, just months after the film's release. Julian Beck, who played Kane in Poltergeist 2, died of stomach cancer in 1985. Will Stamson, who played Taylor in Poltergeist 2, died of a post-operative kidney failure in 1987. And Heather O'Rourke, who played Carol Ann in all 3 films, died at age 12 in 1988 from complications of intestinal stenosis. But the images of Jo Beth Williams thrashing in that pool, surrounded by what we know now are real human remains deeply unsettling today. The Conqueror was RKO Pictures' lavish historical epic about the rise of Genghis Khan, and they cast John Wayne in the lead role. Yes, John Wayne, the quintessential American cowboy, playing a 12th century Mongolian conqueror. Howard Hughes produced it with a massive budget for the time, shooting on location in the Utah desert to capture the most sweeping landscapes of Mongolian steppes. The film was a pretty big miscast and became known as one of the worst movies ever made, but the casting wasn't the real problem, the location was. The film was shot in 1954 in St. George, Utah, picturesque location, beautiful desert scenery, perfect for an historical epic, except St. George is just 100 miles downwind from Nevada, a test site where 11 atomic bombs have been detonated the previous year during atmospheric nuclear testing. John Wayne, Susan Hayward, Agnes Moorehead, and the rest of the cast and crew spent 3 months filming in what was really radioactive fallout. They didn't know, and the government simply didn't tell them. The Atomic Energy Commission assured everyone that the area was definitely safe, and they just filmed their movie while unknowingly being exposed to deadly radiation. But it gets even worse. Director Dick Popel was so pleased with the location that he had 60 tons of dirt from the site shipped back to Hollywood for additional shooting. That means they brought radioactive soil back to Los Angeles and continued filming with it. By the year 1980, approximately 91 out of the 220 people who worked on the film had developed cancer. The average cancer rate in the general population at the time was around 30%, and by 1990, 46 of those cast members and crew had died from cancer. Director Dick Powell even died of cancer in 1963, just 9 years after filming. John Wayne died of stomach cancer in 1979, and Susan Hayward died of brain cancer in 1975. And Pedro Armendariz, who played one of John Wayne's allies, committed suicide in 1973 after being diagnosed with terminal cancer. Even Wayne's 2 sons, Patrick and Michael, who had visited the set in 1954, gathered around as they played with rocks and treating radiation detection like a game. Both later developed cancer, though both survived. The photographs from the set showing smiling actors in costume riding on horses through the Utah desert, unaware that they were slowly being poisoned, just is another Hollywood production that caused so much death that could have been really prevented. John Wayne himself was a heavy smoker, which complicates the causation question. He always attributed cancer to his 6-pack-a-day cigarette habit, but the statistical cluster of cancer cases among the rest of the cast and crew suggested that radiation exposure played a significant role. The US government conducted studies on the health effects of the fallout experience in the region, but the studies were criticized for the methodology and issues of conflict of interest. People who lived in that area during and after nuclear testing have been seeking compensation and recognition for decades. The Conqueror was a box office failure, and is considered one of the worst films ever made. John Wayne in Yellowface playing Genghis Khan was as bad as it sounds. But beyond being a terrible movie, it became a document of government negligence and the human cost of nuclear testing. Noah's Ark, made in 1928, was a Warner Brothers attempt at a biblical epic during the silent film era. Directed by Michael Curtis, the film told 2 parallel stories, one set in biblical times during the Great Flood and another set during World War I, with the same actors playing both roles in both timelines. It was meant to draw people between ancient catastrophe and modern warfare, with the flood scene sequence serving as the film's spectacular centerpiece. Warner Brothers spared no expense, building massive sets and hiring thousands of extras to create the most realistic flood scene ever filmed. They definitely succeeded too well. The film featured a massive flood scene that resulted in deaths of 3 extras and serious injuries to many more. Cinematographer Hal Moore was appalled by the lack of safety precaution and refused to shoot the scenes and simply walked off set. This is a significant moment because walking off a major production could end a cinematographer's career. Moore looked at what Curtis was planning and decided his conscience was worth more than his job. So Barney McGill took over, and 15 cameramen filmed as extras thrashed about in deadly torments of water for hours. The water was released with tremendous force from elevated tanks, creating genuine life-threatening conditions. 3 people drowned and 1 person had to have their leg amputated. Almost a dozen suffered broken limbs and other serious injuries. Among the extras who survived, a young Marin Morrison, who would later change his name to John Wayne. Nearly no one was held accountable, and this was in 1928. There was no safety industry standards, there were no labor unions, nothing was really protected. And Michael Curtis went on to have a legendary career, directing classics like Casablanca, Yankee Doodle Dandy, and Mildred Pierce. He's remembered as one of Hollywood's greatest directors, and the 3 people who drowned during filming during Noah's Ark aren't remembered at all. The stories I'm telling you aren't just Hollywood trivia. They're documentation of a pattern of an industry that has historically valued the shot over human life. They've always prioritized budgets, schedules, everything over safety protocols, and that has allowed directors and producers to push the boundaries until people die. So the next time you watch a big action sequence or a dangerous stunt, remember that real people are doing that work, and real people are trusting that safety protocols are being followed. And producers and directors and crew all around them care more about keeping them alive than getting the shot. And sometimes, as these photographs prove, that trust is sometimes misplaced.